Okay, so this video we're going to talk about prototyping, and hopefully I can answer some questions that I had when I first started getting into user experience or human factors and just some of the terminology that got thrown around that isn't really well defined in my experience. So I'm going to go through these and hopefully clarify some of these for everybody. So first, when you hear the term fidelity, when it comes to prototyping, what we're talking about is as you move up from low to high fidelity, what you're looking for as you make that journey is more alignment with the final product. So your low fidelity prototypes aren't going to match very well what your final product might be looking like, where your high fidelity prototypes will be closer to that point in the design cycle. So when you hear that, and also typically, we'll get to this on the third bullet, but if you hear low fidelity, you're typically thinking wireframes or storyboards. High fidelity, you're talking about using something like Figma or Canva to generate something where you can actually click through the various buttons or interactions. Next, Wizard of Oz testing. So this is something that's kind of peculiar if you're not familiar with it, but it's basically a way that we do user testing. If you don't have the back end of an application built, but you just build the front end, an example of a Wizard of Oz evaluation would be the user does take actions with this interface, but one of the folks running the study, the moderators or whatever you want to refer to them as, they make adjustments on the back end of the interface to show some response to the user's action. So it's kind of like in that wizard, it's based on the Wizard of Oz, right? Where he's just controlling different levers and buttons and stuff. He's not actually doing the things. So that's something we use a lot because a lot of times, again, if we're doing human factors and user experience or HCI right, we should be testing long before there's an actual developed prototype. So this is one of the ways that we can kind of, fudge the boundaries there a little bit to get some good information. Okay, wireframe. This is one that really was awful for me when I started trying to understand what's a wireframe, what's not, etc. And I'll show some examples, but fundamentally a wireframe is imagine something, you're designing an interface and you're going to use like wires or pipe cleaners. You're going to bend them into little squares for the buttons and those kind of things. So if you adapt that to the digital testing space, what we're looking at there is a low fidelity prototype that kind of shows the structure and maybe some minor interactions, but there isn't like a hard and fast line of when you're in wireframe space versus when you're not. Click through, so this is something you'll hear about. There are click through tests. Click through is just simply an interaction where a user selects something and something happens. We say click through because typically the interaction has some kind of an inertia. So, we're reading an article, we see a hyperlink, we click the hyperlink, and the way web browsers are usually designed, it sometimes feels like you're stepping through a door into another space. So, but that's not one to really get hung up about. It's basically just if somebody interacts with your interface and how they do it. Interaction design. So this is, some people will argue that user experience design is only interaction design or vice versa, but yeah, for me, sometimes it's helpful to think about interaction design as specifically designing the interaction. So if we take this in the simplest form, designing the interaction of pushing a button. Any of you that are keyboard aficionados or controller, or especially like fight stick folks, we know the satisfaction of a good button, a physical button. So how do we do that in the digital space? And that's where we get like haptic feedback, sometimes little clicking noises and those kind of things to try to mimic that. So part of interaction design is trying to make the interaction fulfilling for the user, but also it needs to make sense. There are certain things that we would expect to click from or haptic feedback, and then others that we wouldn't. And so you want to understand kind of how that breaks down. But it also can be broader on how the interface, how you interact with the interface and step through the various parts. So it can be kind of a macro side as well. Feedback, so similar to the interaction stuff, this is the feedback from the interface to the user, whether that's audio, haptic, pop-up message, whatever. You always want to make sure you have a feedback method. Even the pushing of a digital button on a web page and the button changes color on click, that is the feedback that tells your user that they did something and there was an effect. And the last two, prototype, mock-up. So as far as I've been able to find, there's no real delineation between them, but just be aware of, if you hear them thrown around, a prototype can be a mock-up can be a prototype. It really just depends on how you want to refer to it. Some folks might say a mock-up has less seriousness to it maybe, or it sounds less professional. I don't really think it matters. None of our prototypes should be really all that professional anyway. All right, so speaking of that, what is a prototype? So, at its foundation, it's some representation, can be physical or digital, of something that is being designed. So, here's some examples of different things. An architectural model, a diorama, those are both physical representations of something somebody might design. You get early alpha versions of software. That could be a digital prototype. Hand-drawn sketches of how this app's going to work or this web page would function. That also is a prototype. Storyboards can be, depending on how you're using them, and etc. and etc. There's countless versions. I mean, you could carve a phone shape out of wood if you wanted to use it. So there's a lot of options there. And so don't get caught up too much on like the types of prototypes or classes of them, low fidelity, high fidelity, or whatever. Just focus on when somebody says we got to prototype this, okay, that means we have to construct something physical or digital that resembles this our design target. So, and then you can select which of these options make the most sense for your purposes. So why do we prototype? Well, user feedback, early testing of assumptions, tangible creations can help your communication on your team. So this is a big, huge one. Especially in digital design, we're often designing things that we have no good physical analog for. So conveying what you expect this feature to do is really, really difficult, and prototypes can help you make that tangible, and then you can go and show your teammates, hey, this is what I'm thinking. And that is a huge benefit of prototyping, and that happens long before you get to users. You can often easily find any big glaring issues, even just going through some of these iterations as a team, find out, oh, that button, that process is kind of weird, and you'll capture that. It's generally cheaper than building like fully fleshed out A or B test interfaces where you might need to create, let's say dual instances of an app. That takes a lot of development resources in some cases, and so doing a lower fidelity prototype that doesn't have to match the development product in any real way can make it more effective and less expensive. And encourages second guessing of design team. Now, I'm not meaning this as it encourages your stakeholders to second guess your work product. What it means is that you should be second guessing your own design. So there's very little that drives iteration and redesign than design. When you actually have to sit down and sketch something out or build something is when you will start making little tweaks and little adjustments to fix it. What this does is it helps facilitate that. Prototyping does. So it's a huge benefit for teams. Now the value of prototyping. So prototyping should be done early and often, and literally as early and as often as possible. It's the least expensive, highest ROI UX or HCI activity you'll undertake. These two data points, one's from McKinsey, one's from the Design Management Institute. These are McKinsey's is the rate of revenue growth, and then Design Management Institute was stock growth. Well, basically, companies that were defined to have more mature and more integrated design methodologies or teams or initiatives typically were more effective companies. And this graph here really kind of captures it, especially if you've ever been on a team building an application or anything. As that application becomes more and more fleshed out, more and more robust, changing things becomes a lot more costly. It takes a lot more time and things to adjust things. Where if we can prototype super quickly down here, where it's at the low of the cost for mistakes and changes, we're in a better position. So here's some just general concepts when you're prototyping that you want to think about. So remember, they're incomplete designs or representations of something. You can have a horizontal versus a vertical prototype. Sometimes these are helpful, especially if you're looking at hierarchical interfaces and things, to see like, okay, does the interface spread horizontally or vertically? Which sounds kind of strange till you start doing it and you realize, and even something to pay attention to as you use your own apps on your phones or whatever it is, we tend to have some sense of spatial reasoning as we go through these things. So what does that actually look like? Precision, so high fidelity versus low fidelity, we've talked about that. Level of interactivity, so this is when you're doing some of your prototyping activities or evaluation steps. So it can be a fixed simulation, there's only one way to go through. That's super helpful when you're really just trying to nail down the structure or framework of the UI and some of those aspects, so that you don't have to deal with all the extraneous user actions. But then you still need to go back and deal with the extraneous user actions. Chauffeured prototyping and Wizard of Oz prototyping. We've already talked about Wizard of Oz. Chauffeured is like right in that general area. Basically, you kind of let them know what to do and then observe them as they try. And then evolution. So this is a big thing with prototyping. Do you do rapid prototyping where you're just throwing away every prototype that doesn't work or something? This will be helpful in a lot of like design jam instances where everybody comes up with 5 designs and 99% of them aren't going to be helpful, but that we contrast with the evolutionary prototyping. So this is the, okay, we think we have a reasonable structure, let's design it. Okay, we do prototyping, we do evaluation, it didn't work quite as well, so let's tweak these things there and then try it again, but the fundamental structure stays. And then just consider, right, the iterative design process. So remember, your design will never survive first contact with the user. So you want to make sure that you're testing, functionality, user requirements, and the overall look and feel of the interface. But one thing I want to note on that is look and feel, you will get to that as you go through higher fidelity prototyping more. And initially, it's really important to understand the structure of the app. So don't worry as much about that part until you get to a higher fidelity option. And then obviously with prototyping, it's also very helpful to communicate the design to your users, clients, stakeholders like that. Okay, so how to prototype? There's countless ways. Like I said, you could cut out an iPhone shape on plywood. But the basic ones that we deal with, right, are kind of fall into these bins. So we've got simple prototyping techniques. This is paper prototyping, simple mock-ups. Um, this is typically going to involve more tangible things, index cards, whatever. Video prototyping can be helpful, but it's not used as often anymore. Um, then we have multimedia animation environments. So the easiest one to think about for this, for me, is PowerPoint. There is some limited functionality, but I've actually been impressed with how well you can prototype with PowerPoint. Now, it's not going to do well because you can create buttons on PowerPoint and link them to other slides, which is helpful to try to mimic an interaction, but you can't really see like all of your interactions in one place or any of those things. That's where the next option, actual prototyping tools, shines, is you can build in those interactions and then take a step back and see them. These are visual programming environments, so Canva kind of does some of this. You got your Wix, Squarespace, those website builders. Then there's wireframe construction prototypes. So Balsamiq is the big software one that at least it's been around for a long time. But Figma, Canva, everything can. What I've noticed has been a big shift is you can usually set in those software tools what you want it to look like. So you can give it like a very sketched wireframe feel, or you can keep it a very crisp design, and that's kind of interesting. So, but you can do them all. But again, I strongly recommend stressing the simpler prototyping techniques first. So paper prototyping, like I just said, far more impactful than it might seem. It's cheap, it's fast, and you're largely looking at function over fit and finish. So I said earlier, don't worry as much about the look and feel from like a strict, visual design sense. What paper prototyping will do, it's not going to look great. So because of that, your user is going to subconsciously ignore some of those things and focus on how the thing works and the framework and structure, which is super, super important for this stage where you're trying to nail down that. Think about it as you're building the house and you need the foundation and the framing before you worry about paint. This is the foundation and framing aspect of digital design. And here's some different examples I wanted to show everybody. So here's one I really like. So this is kind of a horizontal. See this where you can buy actually or download stencil packs where you can get an iPhone stencil like this, and if you don't want to make your own, and kind of step through different things. So that is totally an option that's out there if you want to add some brand identity maybe to your paper prototypes. This one's pretty nice and organized. Here's one's a little bit simpler, but shows that. So this image, at least this appears to be a physical iPhone thing, which again, you can get these, you can 3D print them, you can buy them, and then you slide in papers of a certain size, and then that helps you kind of represent the size of what you're looking at. So here's that example. Here's another one. This is shows kind of as you step through different things. Helpful for some of that, but notice there's no direct interaction, so we're not sure, if you did the user test with this, they wouldn't necessarily be able to, click, quote unquote, into these different options, but it is something you can look at. And here's kind of the page from earlier, actually the first image we looked at, with the keyboard there and everything, and just kind of what it looks like there. And this one actually shows a little bit more back-end information, which can be super, super helpful. So by noting all of these, not only do you start capturing kind of user points where you may need to inform the user of things, but you also have, for example, support both formats over here on the right, where that's something you can give your development team and make sure that they build the database accordingly. And validate when leaving the field. So hey, did you do it right? So yeah, this is another example there. So lo-fi digital prototypes, like we talked about, you got wireframing. So your Balsamiq, Canva, Figma can all do wireframes. Remember, at the wireframing stage, you're concerned about the foundation and the framing. You're not concerned as much about paint at this point. So it's valuable to check these things out for size concerns, especially if you're looking at if your application or use case needs to be very not mobile, like responsive to whatever device it might be viewed on. It can feed into higher fidelity designs for development teams also, which is super helpful. Here's an example of stepping through the versions of prototyping. So, and I would say personally, again, that what's a wireframe question, I'd say we're not out of wireframes till we get to the very end, and even then there's still a wireframe behind this. So it's kind of always there. It's the scaffold that holds everything up, but this is kind of how that can progress as you go through it. So this was one I wanted to include. This is I actually don't know if the software is still available. It's Mockups with a Q. It was a free application you can use to design interfaces. There's a handful of these out there you can usually find, but I wanted to just point out this tends to be what they look like, where you've got a grid or a layout here, and then you have on your left you've got your stencils or your objects, sometimes they're referred to as. So we have rectangles and boxes, which you might think, okay, I need that to make a button, which would be true in like a PowerPoint or something. Or you can just go down and there's a button option. And that has the benefit in a lot of these software instances of assuming an interaction. So it'll give you some of that, like check boxes. You can typically click them. They'll work the way we expect them to. But this can be helpful, and I just wanted to stress this. And every interface is going to be different, but at least if you look at this, you're going to have kind of a rough idea of how that goes. And there are tons of different packs of interface elements for all these software applications. So you can get, for example, if you're trying to build something that's in like a Google ecosystem, you could get a set of stencils or UI elements that match their designs guidance. That can help especially if you're trying to build something that's super high fidelity and so that your users can just kind of expect it to work in a certain way. But just kind of be aware. Then there are also unique or bespoke prototyping tools. These are pretty rare, but this is one I wanted to show you. This is kind of an early stage, from let's see, almost 25 years ago, about how you would prototype a phone tree, which was really interesting on how they used to set these up, and they still do this in a lot of different ways. So sometimes we would use methods like this as well. Okay, so here's some higher fidelity examples. So here's one that shows it appears to be a shopping situation where, and each one is supposed to be stepping through this process. And as we go through, we kind of see how that is going to progress. Here's another example. This one actually I like because it shows the interactions. And so if you click email, you enter your email, you enter your password, hide your password, now we don't see it. You click sign in, now we get to this. So these arrows kind of draw our interactions in a way, which is super helpful. And this is what the more advanced prototyping softwares will give you. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so here's another example where we have some interactions. So here's the profile arrow leads you up to this top, which shows kind of a rough view of this account info page. So these are kind of what we expect with a higher fidelity prototype. So in summary, just keep in mind, different kinds of prototyping are used for different purposes and at different stages. So prototypes answer questions, which is why it's helpful to do it early and often. It's a huge component of conceptual design. You want to consider your interaction types and interfaces. That way you can prompt creativity amongst your team. Let's say you're developing an e-commerce platform, and that's a pretty well trod environment, but those interactions are kind of baked into our experience. But maybe you want to try and speech prototype and how that would work, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But at the early stages of prototyping, that's when you can try the weird stuff. Storyboards can be generated from scenarios. Your card-based prototypes you can get from your use cases. I wouldn't worry as much about linking prototype, prototype methods with specific like instances here where it's storyboards from scenarios. Like, don't worry about that. You can get cards from scenarios too. It's those are just examples there, but and keep in mind, like we talked about with personas, your personas will help populate some of your use cases, which will populate some of your scenarios, because if one of the use cases of using this is to shop for this widget or whatever, then that's the scenario you would try to build. So they do knit together fairly well. But yeah, that's all for prototyping. So go out, try to download something and one of these applications maybe, and fiddle around with it and try to redesign something that we all know well. Use paper, use those things, because they're cheap and easy, and you can get some really interesting feedback even from something that simple. So, all right, thanks.